Gabon just stunned Europe by tearing up an 18-year fishing deal with the EU. No warning, no transition, just gone. For nearly 2 decades, European vessels harvested Gabon's fish, while promises of development quietly sank beneath the waves. So why did Gabon walk away now, and what does it mean? Let's find out. In 2007, Gabon signed what many called a modern fisheries partnership agreement with the European Union, a deal that, at first glance, appeared to be a smart move for a coastal nation with abundant marine wealth but limited capacity to exploit it. Under the agreement, the EU paid Gabon for access to its exclusive fishing zones, and in return, European vessels were allowed to harvest tuna and other commercial species in Gabonese waters. The money supposedly was earmarked for the development of Gabon's domestic fishing industry. On paper, the arrangement had all the ingredients of a fair exchange: revenue for Gabon, seafood supply for Europe, and the promise of capacity building for a developing nation. But the way it played out over 18 years paints a very different picture, one of quiet extraction, minimal accountability, and growing imbalance. The agreement enabled dozens of European trawlers, primarily from France and Spain, to operate in Gabon's rich marine territory. But these ships didn't just fish, they dominated. Equipped with advanced sonar, refrigeration, and industrial hauling systems, they scoured the waters with a level of efficiency that no Gabonese operation could match. Local fishermen found themselves squeezed out, competing with floating factories that could extract in hours what a traditional vessel might take days to gather. Yet the biggest issue wasn't what was taken from the sea. It was what never came ashore. Under the terms of the agreement, there was no requirement for the EU fleets to land their catch in Gabonese ports. The fish went straight from the net to European processing plants, bypassing Gabon entirely. That meant no local jobs in cleaning, packing, freezing, or transporting. No warehouses, no training, no investment in the cold chain systems that could have laid the foundation for a real domestic seafood industry. Just offshore profit and onshore promises. This practice, while technically legal under the agreement, represented a deeper failure: the absence of a developmental clause with teeth. Gabon had opened its waters, but without demanding that the wealth circulate within its economy. The country became a resource provider without infrastructure, without skilled labor, and without a say in how its marine wealth was handled. And as the years passed, that reality became harder to ignore. The financial compensation Gabon received, roughly 1.6 million euros annually, was small change compared to the estimated value of the fish hauled away. Experts estimate the EU fleets take tens of millions worth of tuna and related species each year. In effect, Gabon was leasing its natural endowment for a fraction of its worth, under the illusion that development would somehow follow. The imbalance wasn't just financial, it was structural. Gabon's government had no advanced monitoring system to fully verify how much was being taken. They relied in part on data provided by the very fleets doing the fishing. Enforcement was thin, and concerns over underreporting and bycatch grew steadily. In short, Gabon handed over access, but not control. It received payments, but not power. And while the European boats operated with speed and secrecy, Gabon's coastal communities remained stuck. Fishermen in Port-Gentil and Libreville complained of dwindling stocks and shrinking zones. Young people looking for jobs in the fishing sector found few. The national dream of building a fish-based economy remained suspended, somewhere between ambition and abandonment. What stings even more is how invisible this story remained. Unlike oil or timber, which often draw international scrutiny, the issue of marine access is usually quiet. No headlines, no protests. Just distant vessels on a distant horizon, taking. But over time, resentment grew. Political observers began calling the agreement a legalized siphon. And behind the scenes, a shift was brewing. A new class of Gabonese policymakers, including those close to Brice Oligui Nguema, started asking the uncomfortable questions. If this is a partnership, where is the progress? If this is cooperation, why are we still watching from the shore? Those questions didn't just challenge the EU's approach. They called into question Gabon's readiness to protect its resources, and whether the nation was willing to continue playing the role of resource donor in a system that offered no real return. That's where the break begins. Not with a political speech, but with a growing awareness that being passive in the name of partnership is just another form of being exploited. Now, with the deal dead, Gabon must decide what comes next. But before it builds something new, it must first reckon with what it lost and what it gave away far too cheaply. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. By the time Brice Clotaire Oligui Nguema assumed Gabon's transitional presidency in 2023, the country was already drowning in contracts that looked good on the surface but delivered little beneath. He inherited a legacy of polite diplomacy and polite plunder, a nation rich in forests, oil, minerals, and marine life, but perpetually watching its riches flow out while waiting for the development that never came. The EU fishing agreement was just one example, but it became the most symbolic. Nguema didn't need a revolution to see what was wrong. He needed only to listen, not to foreign consultants, but to Gabonese workers, coastal communities, and industry observers who had grown tired of watching European ships move silently across their horizon, extracting resources like clockwork, with barely a footprint left behind. For him, this wasn't just a policy failure, it was a philosophical insult. The idea that a sovereign nation must lease out its natural wealth to be considered developed. So he chose confrontation over compliance. But it wasn't a rash decision. It was calculated, deliberate, and layered with meaning. Nguema's move to withdraw from the EU fisheries agreement wasn't just about fish. It was a clear pivot toward economic self-respect. It was a signal that Gabon would no longer accept deals that stripped it of agency. No matter how polished the paperwork looked or how diplomatically it was delivered, if the benefit didn't stay within Gabon's borders, it had no place in Gabon's future. This approach, now widely known among his circle as the Nguema doctrine, centers on one radical premise: control must precede development. You cannot build a strong nation on wealth you do not govern. It doesn't matter whether the resource is oil or tuna. If the state doesn't regulate its flow, manage its value chain, and shape its trajectory, the result will always be dependence, no matter how much revenue trickles in. What made this doctrine so powerful was not just its clarity, but its timing. The world was shifting. Global supply chains were being reevaluated. Africa was no longer seen as a backwater of extraction, but as a critical arena for future economic competition. Nguema recognized this moment for what it was: a narrow window to redefine Gabon's relationship with the outside world. And so, his administration began reevaluating all existing trade, investment, and extraction agreements, with an eye not on legality, but on justice. Was the deal serving Gabon? Was it producing jobs? Was it creating internal expertise, or just outsourcing knowledge while importing dependency? The fishing agreement failed on every count. Crucially, Nguema was not opposed to foreign partnerships, but he was done with partnerships that externalized the profit and internalized the poverty. Under his new framework, any future access to Gabon's natural wealth, including its waters, would require local processing, domestic hiring, and infrastructure development. No more fly-in, fly-out economics, no more ghost fleets feeding invisible economies. In private meetings, Nguema reportedly referred to the EU fisheries deal as a rope around the ankle, something that looked like a handshake but functioned like a leash. Ending it wasn't just an economic reset, it was a cultural reset, designed to shock the system, force renegotiation, and, more importantly, teach Gabon to stand its ground in rooms where it was previously told to sit quietly. And the message went further than Brussels. Other African countries, especially those along the western coastline, Mauritania, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, were watching. Many had similar fisheries agreements with the EU. Many shared the same frustrations: lack of transparency, diminishing stocks, and no clear domestic development. Gabon, by withdrawing unilaterally and unapologetically, wasn't just defending its fish, it was challenging an entire model of international economic engagement. Nguema's doctrine has since been extended to other sectors. In the forestry sector, Gabon began tightening regulations on raw timber exports, demanding on-site processing. In the mining sector, reviews of past concessions were launched. Even oil contracts once treated as sacred are being scrutinized with fresh eyes. If there's one thing Nguema is making clear, it's this: Gabon is no longer for sale without terms. This posture has earned him both criticism and admiration. Some Western analysts have accused him of populism, of scaring off investors. But many Africans, and an increasing number of local entrepreneurs, see something different. A leader willing to be unpopular abroad to be just at home. His fisheries withdrawal wasn't a PR stunt. It was the first test case of an idea with far-reaching implications. What happens when an African leader finally says no, not just to one deal, but to a way of doing business? The answer will unfold over time. But for Gabon, it begins now, with empty waters, full sovereignty, and a future that, for the first time in years, will be shaped on its terms. But remember, Brice Oligui Nguema's bold withdrawal from the EU fisheries agreement didn't come from thin air. It was born from years of watching something quietly disappear. Not just the fish, but the value they could have created had Gabon kept even a fraction of what was being exported. This was the real loss, not just ecological, but economic, industrial, and human. And for 18 years, it went unnoticed by most, because it didn't look like a disaster, it looked like nothing. That's the danger of invisible erosion, when resources are taken in plain sight, but no industry rises behind them. No smoke from processing plants, no training programs, no supply chains, just silence. That's what happened in Gabon's fishing sector. A sector with so much potential, yet no infrastructure, no workforce pipeline, and no national stake in the billions worth of marine commodities passing through its waters. The deal with the EU allowed foreign fleets to fish freely and leave without docking, and that's exactly what they did. Catches were immediately exported, often processed in Spain or France, where jobs, packaging, tax revenue, and added value were all retained. Gabon didn't just lose fish, it lost an entire ecosystem of economic opportunity, one that could have redefined its coastal cities and empowered its people. Imagine this. Had those fish been landed in Port-Gentil or Libreville, local cold chains would have had to be built. Gabonese workers could have been trained in sorting, filleting, freezing, and packaging. Local logistics companies would have emerged to transport seafood regionally. Exporters could have stamped product of Gabon on high-value goods sold to Asia or the Middle East. A simple shift, processing fish here instead of there, could have created thousands of jobs and stimulated multiple industries. Instead, Gabon got the rawest deal of all, a check once a year, and no questions asked. But economic loss wasn't the only consequence. The absence of local industry meant no local data, no visibility into what was being taken, no scientific research centers are funded to study stock levels, no feedback loop to tell policymakers whether Gabon's fisheries were being depleted, whether migration patterns were shifting, or whether local fishermen were being pushed to the margins. This void created another, deeper problem. Gabon became reliant on the EU to tell it what it owned. The data that informed policy didn't come from Gabonese marine scientists or satellite surveillance. It came from the operators. In effect, the fishing fleets were self-reporting their catch and self-auditing the truth. This is where Nguema's frustration found its deepest root. How can a nation plan a future around resources it doesn't process, can't track, and never truly sees? In the broader scheme, this isn't just about fish. It's about national blindness. A country that doesn't process its raw materials doesn't just lose money, it loses knowledge. And a country without knowledge of its wealth can never negotiate from strength. This model, extract, export, forget, has plagued much of post-colonial Africa. From cobalt in the Congo to cashews in Côte d'Ivoire, the story has been the same. Raw goods leave, refined goods return, and the profit gap grows wider with each shipment. In Gabon's case, the marine sector represented one of the few remaining frontiers where a new model could have been piloted. But instead of experimentation, there was stagnation. Year after year, the EU paid its fee, sent its fleets, and collected the prize. And while Gabon remained quiet for years, coastal communities didn't. Local fishermen complained that their traditional fishing grounds were becoming harder to navigate. Species that used to populate nearshore waters were now harder to find. Some blamed climate change. Others blamed the sheer efficiency of industrial fishing vessels operating just beyond visible range. Either way, the silence in the waters was growing, and not just metaphorically. And then there was the generational cost. In a country where youth unemployment is a ticking time bomb, an entire blue economy was left on standby. Young people who could have become marine technicians, port managers, biologists, or cold chain experts were instead funneled into informal labor or pushed out of the job market entirely. The fish left, the youth stayed, and nothing connected the two. Nguema's decision then wasn't just about sovereignty. It was about waking up to the full scope of what had been lost. Not just money, not just fish, but the opportunity to build a system and a future rooted in self-sufficiency. Now that the deal is over, the question facing Gabon is no longer what was taken. It's what can still be built. When Gabon announced its withdrawal from the EU's fishing agreement, it wasn't accompanied by fiery speeches or dramatic ultimatums. There were no leaked memos, no slow diplomatic walkouts. Just a simple sovereign statement: we are done. The silence of that decision was deafening, and it caught Europe completely off guard. To Brussels, Gabon had always been seen as one of the stable partners. Not rebellious, not radical. A quiet, resource-rich country that preferred negotiation over disruption. For years, Gabonese officials nodded politely in meetings while European policymakers talked about sustainability, cooperation, and shared growth. The agreement had been renewed several times without much fuss. On paper, it looked like a model partnership, one they could cite in reports, studies, and speeches as proof that Europe's presence in Africa was balanced and beneficial. But that illusion shattered overnight. When the announcement came, the immediate response from EU officials was surprise. They acknowledged Gabon's legal right to withdraw, but hadn't seen it coming. No warning, no renegotiation phase, no staged diplomacy, just the reality that one of Europe's oldest African fishing partners had walked away, unapologetically. Behind that surprise was something deeper: fear. Because Gabon's exit wasn't just a loss of fish. It was a rupture in a carefully maintained facade. If Gabon, once considered predictable and cooperative, could reject a deal that Europe had branded as mutually beneficial, what did that mean for other African countries with similar agreements? Could this trigger a domino effect? That possibility shook Brussels. Across the West African coast, the EU has signed dozens of fisheries partnership agreements (FPAs) with countries like Senegal, Mauritania, Guinea-Bissau, and Ivory Coast. These agreements form a core part of the EU's seafood supply chain, particularly for tuna, which ends up on supermarket shelves across France, Spain, and Italy. If Gabon's logic were to spread, the logic that fish caught in African waters should be landed, processed, and profited from in Africa, the economic foundation of the EU's fishing model in the region could collapse. The fear in Europe wasn't about Gabon's capacity to process fish. It was about Gabon's courage to say no, and the precedent that it sets. Some European analysts immediately tried to frame Gabon's decision as irrational, perhaps even politically motivated. A few suggested that Nguema was posturing for domestic approval, using nationalism to distract from internal challenges. But those explanations fell flat. The reality was harder to swallow. Gabon had spent 18 years in a quiet deal, learned from the experience, and simply outgrew the arrangement. EU officials also knew that Gabon's decision came at a time when their leverage in Africa was weakening. The days of unquestioned European authority on the continent are fading fast. Across Africa, a new generation of leaders is emerging, less impressed by legacy institutions, more focused on value retention and strategic autonomy. In that landscape, Gabon's exit wasn't a rebellion, it was an alignment, and that alignment has allies. Countries like Mauritania and Senegal have been publicly questioning the fairness of EU fishing deals. Local fishermen in Senegal have staged protests against European trawlers, accusing them of wiping out fish stocks and leaving little for domestic markets. Activists across the continent have warned for years that these agreements drain Africa's maritime wealth while dressing the process in diplomatic niceties. Now Gabon has given them a blueprint. Even countries not currently renegotiating deals are taking note. What Gabon proved is that walking away doesn't require chaos. It doesn't require war or sanctions. It only requires clarity and the will to say, this no longer works for us. For the EU, this isn't just a foreign policy problem, it's a commercial one. European companies dependent on Gabonese tuna will now have to source elsewhere or accept higher costs. The logistical pipelines and from the sea to European ports face disruption. and the idea that the EU could maintain long-term access to African natural resources through old models is now under serious threat. In response, Brussels has said it remains open to dialogue and future partnerships, but the tone has changed. There's less talk of automatic renewals and more of mutual respect. That's not diplomacy. That's damage control. Because deep down, Europe knows something has shifted. The Gabon it thought it knew, cooperative, quiet, compliant, no longer exists. In its place stands a nation that, after years of being seen but not heard, has decided to speak in actions instead of words. And the rest of Africa? They're listening. Do you think more nations will do the same? How will Africa look if they do? Let us know in the comments section. Is the change happening? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.